Hi everyone, and welcome to our impromptu lecture this week, how to write a good research question. So for this video lecture for today, I'm going to introduce you to the assignment that's due next Tuesday, February 8th. We're going to talk about research questions and the two kinds that I would recommend for your upcoming assignment. And then finally, we're going to talk about time series versus cross-sectional questions. And finally, I'll conclude with a few little tips. But first, what is due February 8th at 11 a.m.? It is your research paper idea. So what is your research question that you would like to work on for your term paper? So this is the actual assignment. You can check it out on Canvas too. But what is your research question that you would like to work on over the course of this semester? Here it says it must be a why or what effect question. We'll get into those in this video lecture. The second component is, given your research question, what is your dependent variable that you're going to be looking at? And does it capture variation across space or variation over time? And we're going to get into both of these points today. Okay, we're going to revisit this again at the end of the video lecture just to sort of make sure that we all understand what's going on. So what makes a good research question? So good research questions explain some kind of variation. In other words, I shouldn't be looking at states that only have really good educational outcomes. I should be looking at all kinds of states, right, with all kinds of educational outcomes. I shouldn't just be looking at cities with low income inequality. I should be looking at all cities, regardless of what level of income inequality they have. This is because research questions, good research questions, attempt to explain some kind of variation, okay? Now here, there are two types of research questions. We have sort of the traditional why research question, and then the second one is a what effect question. So these why questions are going to be, why is there variation in states' educational outcomes, okay? But because you all are now ending your academic careers at the University of Idaho, you have likely read enough stuff at this point to have a good sense of a specific thing you would want to study. So this is why I also include the what effect questions. So what effect does investments in quality food in school districts have on educational outcomes, for instance? Perhaps you're interested in that first component, right? The effect of quality food on educational outcomes. But I could have asked that question one of two ways. Like if I had no idea where I wanted to take my research question, I would have said, why do some states have better educational outcomes than others? Whereas the what effect question is, what effect does quality food have on educational outcomes? Because I've read a bunch in the past few years, that might be an area that I'm interested in, okay? Now, here are a few examples. I just gave sort of a preliminary one, but here are some ones that I have pictures for, okay? So why have home prices in Boise risen over time? So these are examples of why questions, okay? Why have home prices in Boise risen over time? So we can see in 2009, the median home price is about $168,000. In 2019, it was $325,000. I bet it's a whole lot more now, okay? And here, our dependent variable is Boise home prices. Here's another one. Why are so many legislators lawyers? Why are so many legislators lawyers? It's a good question, right? And you can actually see them over here in this sort of marigold color, right? It's an interesting fact, right? And there is actually work on this. In any case, though, the dependent variable here is the percent of legislators in Congress. It's quite a bit. And one of the reasons is that their professional network helps them campaign and raise more money. That's the punchline there. In any case, though, you get the idea. Here is another why question, and here's the dependent variable. The next one, why do some countries have more corruption than other countries? The red means bad, everyone. The red is a bad color. This is the perceived corruption index by country. And our dependent variable here is the corruption perception index by country. And you can see that most of Europe, and you can see sort of the tip of Australia here, along with the United States and Canada, do reasonably well. The last one is, why do some states have higher turnout than others? So as you can see, this is turnout by state. I should be clear here, this says the dependent variable is turnout. VEP, this stands for voter eligible population. There are different ways that you can measure turnout by state, and this is the more precise one, is voter eligible population. The darker means that more people in that state turn out. So we see pretty high participation in Washington and Oregon and along the coasts, and also a little bit in the Midwest, although they have sort of a strong civic culture there. In any case, though, again, it's a research question of why do some states have higher turnout than others, and the dependent variable is turnout. But again, some of you might have a better idea of where you want to take a research question. Okay, you might know what your independent variable is already. And that's where these what effect questions have. So I've taken all of these why questions and turned them into what effect questions. Okay, what effect has zoning had on home prices in Boise over time? Okay, again, our dependent variable is exactly the same. But the only difference is that my independent variable, I've included my primary independent variable in here, which is zoning. And so here we know that the more restrictive the zoning, the more likely that home prices are to go up. Okay, we know that from a lot of research. The next one is, what effect does democracy have on corruption? So here our independent variable is democracy, and our dependent variable is still corruption, specifically the corruption perceived index. Our next one is, what effect do voter ID laws have on turnout? And the same is true still, right? Our dependent variable is turnout using voting eligible population, and voter ID laws would be our independent variable. Okay. Really, there is not a huge difference in the idea of a why versus a what effect question. It's more if you already sort of have a sense of what you want to investigate for both your independent and dependent variable. But if you're sort of coming to a puzzle of variation without any preconceived notions about what you think causes that, then you can go with a why question. The second thing that I would want you to dig into for your next assignment is whether you're going to be using a cross-sectional or a time series question. Cross-sectional questions explain variation across space. They explain variation across space. So that can mean variation across countries, across states, across people, across continents. But you are looking at one point in time, okay? You're looking at one point in time, so only 2016, we're looking at the turnout in each of those states, okay, in all 50 states, but just in 2016. That's a cross-sectional question. Why here, why does why? This is your dependent variable. And your dependent variable, much like we mentioned earlier in the lecture, has to vary. You have to have variation in your dependent variable that you're trying to explain. So it has to take on at least two values. So it has to be 0 or 1 at the very least, but it can be more, right? It could be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, so on and so forth. Okay. An example here is, what effect do voter ID laws have on turnout? This is variation in the dependent variable across space, right? This is variation in the dependent variable across space. So these states have higher turnout compared to southern states, which have lower turnout, with the exception of Florida, which is probably attributable to the portion of the population that's older, which tends to vote at higher rates. In any case, though, here we can see that there is variation, so it's meeting this last condition, right? There is variation across space, but we're looking at one point in time. In fact, this comes from MIT's election project. This is 2020's turnout by state, but it's looking at one point in time and across space. Okay, so this is a cross-sectional question. By contrast, a time series question looks at one unit. It looks at one unit. Why does Y vary over time in a given country, state, political leader, political institution, so on and so forth. So again, we are going to try to be explaining variation in our dependent variable over time, but it's only going to be focused on one unit. So one country, one state, one institution. But if your dependent variable captures variation over time, you are dealing with a time series research question. So here is an example. Why have home prices risen in Boise over time? We are looking at one unit, right? That is Boise. We are looking over time from 2009 to 2019, right? So we're looking at the same individual unit of analysis, but we're looking at it over time. So for your project, for your submission for next week, you have to choose one or the other. You have to choose either time series or cross-sectional. Do not do both, because once you do both, it requires more sophisticated statistical techniques, okay? Now, let me provide a few suggestions. Your question does not need to be unique, okay? You can ask any of the questions that I just listed off in this presentation, but oftentimes in political science, we ask very similar questions over and over and over again, but we apply them in different contexts, okay? What is the effect of education on voter turnout? That answer might be different in the 1970s than it is today, okay? What effect does democracy have on war? We have a whole field on that, right? We keep asking that question over and over and over again. Your question does not need to be unique, okay? However, I also don't want you to feel too limited, okay? I also don't want you to feel too limited. You can choose a non-political sciencey question, right? You could choose something about why home prices in Boise are so high, right? A few years ago, we had someone who did a project on celebrity in politics, right? And there is actually literature on that, right? Star Power, American Democracy in the Age of the Celebrity Candidate, right? There is work to go off of that. So you can think about what your own interests are, and we can try to brainstorm ways to help it fit the project in this class. Some other examples are authoritarian contagion. So this is a really hot one right now in comparative politics, is this idea of how contagious is democratic backsliding. Turns out it might be contagious, okay? Another component is here is another question: does home ownership influence political behavior? Evidence from administrative data. This seems like a really obvious question, right? You could choose a very obvious question. That's perfectly fine. There are many very obvious questions that are really actually hard to prove. This is some of the most recent work on this that is helps answer this question for us, okay? And it seems like an obvious question, but we actually didn't have an answer to it before a year ago. Okay, so you can choose something that's interesting to you. You can choose something that's really relevant in the news right now. And you can even choose something that feels really obvious. I don't want you to feel too constrained by whatever you think you should do in this class. Okay. There are obviously limitations here, but I do want to support you in whatever would be interesting to you as you finish out your academic career here. So again, let's revisit the guidelines from before. So what is your research question that you would like to work on for your paper here? It must be either a why question or a what effect question. The second one is, given your research question, what is your dependent variable? Okay, so you should be able to identify from your research question what your dependent variable is. And then you should be able to tell me whether it is a time series question or a cross-sectional question. Does it capture variation across space? That's cross-sectional. Does it capture variation over time? That's a time series question. So you should be able to do these 3 things, okay? Now, for next time, for Thursday, I would like you to read White's Political Participation Amid Mass Incarceration. This is an annual review, and we'll talk a little bit more on Thursday about what those are. I'd also like you to listen to Ezra Klein's podcast, Are You a Political Hobbyist? This one's a little long, so make sure you budget some time. And finally, I would like you to bring a few ideas for your own questions. I would like you to bring a few ideas for your own questions that you are thinking about submitting for next Tuesday. Otherwise, I hope you all have a good Tuesday. I assume that's the day you're listening to this. Otherwise, I will see you all Thursday.